What happens when a mother's desperation to preserve her family's legacy leads her down a path of unthinkable moral corruption? In 1848, Georgia, one widow's calculated decision would shatter the lives of everyone under her roof. Subscribe to the channel for more shocking historical stories that will leave you speechless. The autumn rain of 1848 drummed relentlessly against the tall windows of Hensley Manor, each drop echoing like a funeral march through the grand hallways that had once resonated with laughter and prosperity. Margaret Hensley stood motionless in her late husband's study, her black mourning dress a stark contrast against the mahogany furniture that bore witness to 3 generations of family success. At 42, Margaret possessed the kind of austere beauty that commanded respect in Georgia's high society. Her steel-grey eyes, which had once sparkled with the confidence of a woman secure in her position, now held the cold calculation of someone who had watched her world crumble in the span of 6 months. "Mrs. Hensley," came the hesitant voice of Thomas Whitmore, the family lawyer, as he shuffled through papers with obvious discomfort. "I'm afraid the situation is more precarious than we initially thought." Margaret's fingers tightened around the crystal glass of brandy she held, the amber liquid trembling slightly. "Speak plainly, Thomas. I've buried my husband and watched vultures circle my property for months. I can handle whatever truth you're hiding." The elderly lawyer removed his spectacles, cleaning them with unnecessary attention to detail. "Without a male heir and given the debts accumulated during Charles's illness, your brothers-in-law have a legitimate claim to contest the will. Georgia law favors male relatives in such circumstances, and they're arguing that 3 unmarried daughters cannot adequately manage an estate of this magnitude." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but hearing it spoken aloud made her chest tighten with a rage so pure it threatened to consume her. "They want to take everything," she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. "Everything Charles built, everything his father built before him." Through the study's windows, she could see the vast cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon, dotted with the small cabins where nearly 60 enslaved people lived and worked. This land had been in the Hensley family for over 50 years, transformed from wilderness into one of the most prosperous plantations in the county. "There might be alternatives," Thomas said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper. "If one of your daughters were to marry quickly, to a man of good standing." "My daughters?" Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Eleanor is too headstrong, Catherine too timid, and Mary too young. Besides, any man worthy of this estate would want to control it himself. I'd simply be trading one form of male dominance for another." As if summoned by their mention, the sound of feminine voices drifted from the main parlor. Margaret's 3 daughters were taking their afternoon tea, a ritual that had continued even through the darkest days of their father's illness and death. The normalcy of it felt almost obscene, given the circumstances. Eleanor, at 21, was the eldest and most like her mother in temperament. She possessed a sharp intellect that made her unsuitable for the passive role society expected of women. Her auburn hair and green eyes had attracted several suitors, but she had dismissed them all with a disdain that worried Margaret. Catherine, 19, was the beauty of the family. Her golden hair and delicate features had made her the subject of much attention at social gatherings, but her gentle nature made her easily overwhelmed by conflict. She was the daughter most likely to bend under pressure, but also the one most likely to break. Mary, the youngest at 18, combined her sister's best qualities with a dangerous streak of idealism. She had been her father's favorite, and his death had hit her hardest. Lately, she had been asking uncomfortable questions about the treatment of their enslaved workers, questions that made Margaret deeply uneasy. "Mrs. Hensley," Thomas continued, "there is one other consideration. The law does recognize male heirs, regardless of circumstances of birth, if properly legitimized." Margaret's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "What exactly are you suggesting, Thomas?" The lawyer's face flushed red. "I'm merely pointing out legal precedents. There have been cases where unconventional solutions have preserved family legacies. Of course, such arrangements would require the utmost discretion and careful planning." After Thomas left, Margaret remained in the study as darkness fell around her. The house grew quiet except for the settling of old wood and the distant sounds of the evening routines in the slave quarters. She poured herself another brandy and walked to the portrait gallery that lined the main hallway. The faces of Hensley men stared down at her from their gilded frames. Her late husband Charles, his father William, and his grandfather Robert, all strong men who had built and maintained this empire through determination and ruthless pragmatism. They had never faced the prospect of losing everything simply because they lacked the right anatomy. "What would you have done?" she whispered to Charles's portrait, painted just 5 years earlier, when he was still healthy and confident. "What would any of you have done?" The answer came to her slowly, like a poison seeping through her veins. These men had done whatever was necessary to preserve their legacy. They had bought and sold human beings, had crushed competitors, had made deals with devils when it served their purposes. They had never let sentiment or social conventions stand in the way of survival. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the windows that overlooked the slave quarters. Somewhere out there, among the 60 souls who belonged to her family, was the solution to her problem. It would require careful selection, meticulous planning, and the complete suppression of any moral qualms. But it would work. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the ground like a crystalline shroud. Margaret dressed with particular care, choosing a dark blue dress that conveyed authority without ostentation. She had spent the night refining her plan, considering every angle and potential complication. Her first stop was the plantation's records room, where detailed information about every enslaved person was meticulously maintained. She spread the ledgers across the desk, studying them with the same attention she had once given to social calendars and household accounts. What she needed was specific: a young man, healthy and intelligent, but most importantly, one whose appearance would serve her purposes. As she read through the descriptions, one entry caught her attention and held it. Samuel, age 22, field worker, born on property. Notable characteristics: albinism, exceptional physical strength, literate, unauthorized. Parents, deceased. Siblings, none. Margaret set down the ledger and stared out the window. Samuel. She had seen him occasionally during her inspections of the fields, always from a distance. His condition made him unmistakable: pale skin that burned easily in the Georgia sun, white hair that caught the light like spun silver, and eyes that appeared almost colorless in certain light. In the twisted logic of the time, his albinism made him appear more white than other enslaved people, despite his African ancestry. It was a cruel irony that she intended to exploit fully. She called for Jeremiah, the plantation's overseer, a hard man who had worked for the Hensley family for over 15 years. He entered the records room with his hat in his hands, his weathered face showing the respect and slight fear that Margaret had learned to cultivate. "You wanted to see me, Mrs. Hensley?" "Tell me about Samuel," she said without preamble. "The albino boy in the East Fields." Jeremiah's eyebrows rose slightly. "Samuel, he's a good worker, ma'am. Stronger than most despite his condition, keeps to himself mostly. The other slaves well, they're not always kind about his appearance." "Is he trustworthy?" "As much as any of them can be, I suppose. He's never caused trouble, never tried to run. His reading is a problem, don't know how he learned, but he did. I've been meaning to address that." Margaret waved dismissively. "The reading doesn't matter now. I want him brought to the house. Tell him he's being reassigned to indoor duties." Jeremiah looked puzzled, but nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "When would you like him to start?" "Today? And Jeremiah?" Margaret's voice carried a warning that made the overseer straighten. "This reassignment is to remain confidential. Samuel is not to discuss his new duties with anyone, and neither are you. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am, perfectly understood." As Jeremiah left to fetch Samuel, Margaret walked to her private sitting room and poured herself a cup of tea with hands that trembled slightly. What she was contemplating went against every social convention, every moral principle she had been raised to uphold. But those principles belonged to a world where women had options, where survival didn't depend on producing male heirs at any cost. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock at the sitting room door. "Come in," Margaret called, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. Samuel entered hesitantly, his unusual appearance even more striking in the refined setting of the house. He was tall and well-built, with the kind of physical strength that came from years of hard labor. His pale skin showed the effects of sun exposure despite his condition, freckles and patches of redness that spoke to the harsh realities of field work. But it was his eyes that gave Margaret pause. They were a pale blue-gray, almost colorless, and they held an intelligence that was both surprising and unsettling. This was not the broken spirit she had expected, but a man who was very much aware of his circumstances and his own worth. "You sent for me, ma'am." His voice was deep and carefully modulated, with the precise diction of someone who had taught himself to speak properly. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her mind calculating possibilities and risks. "Yes, Samuel, I have a proposition for you, one that will change your circumstances considerably, but will require absolute discretion and obedience." Samuel's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in those pale eyes, wariness perhaps, or recognition that this moment would define the rest of his life. "I'm listening, ma'am." Margaret set down her teacup and looked directly at him. "I need an heir, Samuel, a male heir who can inherit this plantation and preserve the Hensley legacy. My daughters, despite their many qualities, cannot fulfill this role in the eyes of the law." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel's face remained carefully neutral, but Margaret could see the rapid calculation happening behind his eyes. He understood exactly what she was proposing, and the implications terrified and intrigued him in equal measure. "And you believe I can help with this problem?" he asked carefully. "I believe you can solve it entirely," Margaret replied, "but the arrangement would require certain accommodations. You would be moved to the house, given better quarters, better food, better treatment. In return, you would father children with my daughters, children who would be raised as legitimate Hensley heirs." Samuel was quiet for so long that Margaret began to wonder if he would refuse outright. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "And if I refuse?" Margaret's smile was cold and sharp. "Then you return to the fields and I find another solution. But Samuel, I should mention that refusal would indicate a certain unreliability that might require addressing." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but perfectly clear. Samuel nodded slowly, his shoulders squaring as he accepted the reality of his situation. "What would you need me to do?" The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the main parlor as Margaret's 3 daughters sat in their customary circle, each engaged in the ladylike pursuits that had been drilled into them since childhood. Eleanor worked on her embroidery with sharp, precise stitches that betrayed her agitation. Catherine painted delicate watercolor flowers, her brushstrokes becoming increasingly erratic as tension filled the room. Mary read from a volume of poetry, though her eyes kept drifting to the windows that overlooked the slave quarters. Margaret entered the parlor with the measured steps of a general preparing for battle. She had spent the morning finalizing arrangements with Samuel, and now came the most delicate part of her plan, convincing her daughters to participate. "Girls, please set aside your activities. We need to discuss the family's future." Eleanor looked up first, her green eyes immediately alert to the gravity in her mother's tone. "Has something happened with the lawyers?" In a manner of speaking, yes. Margaret took her seat in the high-backed chair that had been her husband's favorite, a position that commanded attention and respect. "Your uncles are moving forward with their challenge to your father's will. They intend to claim the plantation within the month." Catherine's paintbrush clattered to the floor, leaving a splash of blue paint on the Persian rug. "But surely they can't just take everything. Father left the estate to you." "Your father left the estate to me with the understanding that it would pass to his male heirs," Margaret replied coldly. "Since we have none, the law favors your uncle's claim." Mary closed her book with a sharp snap. "Then we'll fight them in court. We'll hire better lawyers, present a stronger case." "With what money?" Margaret's voice cut through her youngest daughter's optimism like a blade. "The legal fees alone would bankrupt us, and even if we won, we'd be left with a mountain of debt and no way to manage the plantation effectively. Society doesn't trust women to run enterprises of this magnitude." Eleanor set down her embroidery and leaned forward. "What are you proposing, Mother?" Margaret had rehearsed this moment countless times, but facing her daughter's expectant faces made her throat tighten with an emotion she couldn't afford to acknowledge. I'm proposing we create our own male heirs." The silence that followed was absolute. Catherine's face went pale as understanding dawned, while Mary's eyes widened with shock. Eleanor's expression remained carefully controlled, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the arms of her chair. "Mother," Eleanor said slowly, "surely you're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting we do whatever is necessary to preserve our family's legacy," Margaret replied firmly. "I've identified a suitable candidate among our workers, someone whose unique characteristics would ensure that any children born would be accepted as legitimate heirs." Catherine found her voice first, though it came out as barely a whisper. "You want us to... with a slave?" "I want you to secure your futures," Margaret snapped. "Do you think your uncles will provide for you once they take control? Do you think they'll allow you to remain in this house? To maintain your social standing? You'll be lucky if they don't sell you off to the first men willing to take you without dowries." Mary stood abruptly, her book falling to the floor. "This is monstrous, Mother. You're talking about using a human being as breeding stock and asking us to participate in our own degradation." "Degradation?" Margaret's voice rose dangerously. "I'm talking about survival. I'm talking about preserving everything your father and grandfather built. Would you rather maintain your precious moral superiority while living in poverty?" Eleanor had been silent throughout this exchange, her sharp mind working through the implications. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but cold. "Who is this candidate you've selected?" "Samuel, the albino boy from the East Fields. His appearance would minimize certain complications." Catherine made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "His appearance? Mother, you're talking about rape. You're talking about forcing us to bear children with a man who has no choice in the matter." "I'm talking about an arrangement that benefits everyone involved," Margaret replied icily. "Samuel will be moved to better quarters, given better food and treatment. Your children will inherit one of the most prosperous plantations in Georgia. Where exactly is the tragedy in that?" Mary began pacing the room like a caged animal. "The tragedy is in reducing human beings to their utility. The tragedy is in perpetuating a system that treats people as property. Father may have owned slaves, but he never forced his daughters to become breeding mares." "Your father never faced the prospect of losing everything," Margaret shot back. "And he certainly never had to navigate a world that considers women incapable of independent thought or action." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, her gaze fixed on the distant fields. "What if we refuse? Then you'll watch everything you've ever known disappear," Margaret said simply. "Your uncles will take the plantation, sell off the slaves, and divide the proceeds among themselves. You'll be left with nothing but the clothes on your backs and whatever charity they're willing to provide." The room fell silent again, each daughter lost in her own thoughts. Catherine wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, while Mary continued her restless pacing. Eleanor remained at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "How would this arrangement work?" Eleanor asked without turning around. Margaret felt a surge of triumph, mixed with revulsion at her eldest daughter's pragmatic acceptance. "Samuel would be given quarters in the east wing of the house. Each of you would spend time with him according to a schedule I would arrange. Once pregnancies are confirmed, he would return to his previous duties, though with improved conditions." "And the children?" Catherine's voice was barely audible. "Would be raised as legitimate Hensley heirs. With all the privileges and responsibilities that entails, they would inherit the plantation and continue our family's legacy." Mary stopped pacing and turned to face her mother. "What about Samuel? What happens to him after he's served your purpose?" "Samuel will be well cared for, as will any other children he might father. He understands the arrangement and has agreed to it." "Agreed?" Mary's voice cracked with emotion. "How can a slave agree to anything? He has no choice but to comply or face punishment." Margaret's patience was wearing thin. "Samuel has more choice in this matter than any of us do. He can secure a better life for himself and his future children, or he can remain in the fields. We, on the other hand, face complete ruin if we don't act." Eleanor finally turned from the window, her face set in hard lines that made her look years older. "I need time to think about this." "We don't have time," Margaret replied sharply. "Your uncle's lawyers will be here next week to begin the formal proceedings. If we're going to act, it must be soon." Catherine stood on shaking legs, her face still pale, but her voice stronger than before. "I can't do this, Mother. I won't be party to such an arrangement." "Then you'll be party to our destruction instead," Margaret said coldly. "But that's your choice to make." As Catherine fled the room in tears, Margaret turned her attention to her remaining daughters. Mary's face showed a mixture of disgust and defiance, while Eleanor's expression remained unreadable. "I need to speak with him," Eleanor said finally. "If I'm to consider this arrangement, I need to understand what kind of man we're dealing with." Margaret nodded, having expected this request. "That can be arranged. But remember, Eleanor, discretion is paramount. If word of this reaches the wrong ears, we'll face social ruin regardless of the legal outcome." That evening, Margaret arranged for Samuel to be brought to the library under the pretense of helping with inventory. Eleanor waited among the leather-bound volumes that had been her refuge since childhood, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. When Samuel entered, Eleanor was struck again by his unusual appearance. In the lamplight, his pale skin seemed almost luminous, and his colorless eyes held a depth that unsettled her. He moved with careful grace, clearly aware that he was being evaluated. "Miss Eleanor," he said, with a respectful nod, "your mother said you wished to speak with me." Eleanor gestured to a chair across from her, noting how he hesitated before sitting. Even in this private setting, the social barriers between them remained firmly in place. "I want to understand your perspective on my mother's proposal," Eleanor said carefully. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes studying her face. "May I speak freely, Miss Eleanor?" "Please do." "Your mother has offered me a choice between two forms of servitude. In one, I remain in the fields, subject to the overseer's whip and the uncertainty of sale or punishment. In the other, I become a different kind of tool, but one that's valued and protected." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at his blunt assessment. "And you prefer the latter?" "I prefer survival," Samuel replied simply, "and if I'm to be used, I'd rather it be in a way that might benefit any children I father. You understand that any children born from this arrangement would be raised as white, with no acknowledgement of your paternity." Something flickered in Samuel's eyes, pain perhaps or resignation. "I understand that any children I father will have opportunities I never had. They'll be educated, well-fed, and free. That's more than most slaves can hope for their offspring." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "What do you know about my sisters and me? I know that Miss Catherine is kind to the house servants, that Miss Mary questions the treatment of slaves, and that you're considered the most intelligent of the three." Samuel paused, then added quietly, "I also know that none of you chose this situation any more than I did." The honesty in his voice caught Eleanor off guard. She had expected subservience or resentment, not this clear-eyed assessment of their mutual predicament. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified," Samuel admitted, "but fear is a luxury I can't afford. I learned long ago that survival requires adapting to circumstances beyond my control." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, much as she had done earlier in the parlor. "My mother believes this arrangement will save our family. I'm not certain it won't destroy us instead." "Destruction and salvation often look very similar from the inside," Samuel said quietly. "The difference is usually only clear in hindsight." When Eleanor turned back to him, she saw something in his expression that she hadn't expected. Compassion. Not pity, which would have been insulting, but genuine understanding of the impossible position they all found themselves in. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "I want your word that you'll treat my sisters with respect and kindness." "You have it," Samuel replied without hesitation. "And I want to know that you understand the risks we're all taking. If this arrangement is discovered, it won't just be our social standing at stake. Your life would be forfeit." Samuel nodded gravely. "I understand the stakes, Miss Eleanor, perhaps better than anyone." As Eleanor left the library that night, she felt the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. In her room, she found Catherine sitting on her bed, still in her day dress, staring at nothing. "Have you decided?" Catherine asked without looking up. Eleanor sat beside her sister and took her hand. "I think Mother is right about one thing. We don't have any good choices, only degrees of terrible ones." Catherine's fingers tightened around Eleanor's. "I keep thinking about what Father would say if he knew what we were considering." "Father never had to face the prospect of losing everything because of his gender," Eleanor replied, echoing their mother's earlier words. "He had the luxury of moral certainty because society was designed to protect his interests." "So we abandon our morals to protect our interests?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "I think we do whatever we must to survive, and we try to minimize the harm we cause in the process." Down the hall, Mary sat at her writing desk, composing a letter she would never send. In it, she poured out her anguish and confusion, her horror at what her mother proposed, and her terror at the alternative. She wrote about Samuel, about the intelligence she had seen in his eyes and the dignity he maintained despite his circumstances. Most of all, she wrote about the crushing realization that in a world designed by and for men, women and slaves alike were reduced to their biological functions, breeding stock and labor, valued only for what they could produce. As the night deepened and the house settled into uneasy quiet, 3 young women lay awake in their beds, each grappling with an impossible choice. In the East Wing, their mother sat in her late husband's study, staring at legal documents that would strip away everything she had ever known. And in the small room above the kitchen, where Samuel had been given new quarters, a young man who had never been allowed to dream of freedom found himself contemplating a different kind of bondage, one that might, paradoxically, offer the only path to something resembling dignity in a world that had never recognized his humanity. The die had been cast, but it had not yet landed. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would echo through generations, shaping lives not yet born and destroying innocence that could never be reclaimed. The first snow of winter fell on Hensley Manor like a shroud, covering the grounds in pristine white that seemed to mock the moral darkness settling over the household. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's proposal, and the weight of impending decision had transformed the once warm family home into a place of whispered conversations and averted gazes. Eleanor had been the first to capitulate, her practical nature overriding her moral objections. She had informed her mother of her decision in the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss household accounts, but Margaret had seen the cost in her daughter's hollow eyes and rigid posture. Catherine had held out longer, spending days in her room, emerging only for meals where she sat in silence, picking at her food like a bird afraid of poison. But the arrival of legal papers from their uncle's attorneys had finally broken her resistance. The documents made it clear that the challenge to their father's will was proceeding rapidly, and that the family had perhaps a month before losing everything. Mary remained defiant, but her defiance was increasingly hollow as the reality of their situation became undeniable. She had taken to long walks around the plantation, observing the lives of the enslaved people with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the complete powerlessness that defined their existence. On a grey December morning, Margaret summoned her daughters to the morning room, where breakfast had been laid out with unusual care. The best china gleamed on the mahogany table, and fresh flowers, hothouse roses that had cost a small fortune, provided a splash of colour against the winter gloom. "I've made the final arrangements," Margaret announced without preamble as her daughters took their seats. "Samuel has been moved to the East Wing, and I've prepared a schedule that will ensure efficiency while maintaining discretion." Eleanor's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. "A schedule? Eleanor, you'll begin tomorrow evening. Catherine, you'll follow the week after. Mary—" Margaret's gaze fixed on her youngest daughter, who had gone pale as parchment. "You'll have additional time to reconcile yourself to the necessity of this arrangement." "I won't do it," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't." Margaret's expression hardened. "Then you'll watch your sisters sacrifice themselves for a family legacy you're too selfish to help preserve." The cruelty of the words hit Mary like a physical blow. Eleanor reached across the table to grasp her sister's hand, while Catherine made a small sound of distress. "Mother, that's enough," Eleanor said sharply. "We're all struggling with this situation. Attacking Mary won't make it easier for any of us." "What will make it easier," Margaret replied coldly, is accepting reality and moving forward with dignity. This family has faced challenges before, and we've always done what was necessary to survive. After breakfast, Eleanor found herself walking through the house with new eyes, seeing it perhaps for the last time as the innocent place of her childhood. Every portrait, every piece of furniture, every carefully maintained detail spoke of generations of Hensley prosperity and pride. By tomorrow evening, she would begin the process that might preserve it all, or destroy what remained of her soul. She made her way to the East Wing, ostensibly to check on the arrangements for Samuel's new quarters. The wing had been unused for years, serving mainly as storage for furniture and family heirlooms, but Margaret had transformed one of the larger rooms into comfortable living space, complete with a proper bed, writing desk, and small sitting area. Samuel was there when she arrived, standing by the window that overlooked the kitchen gardens. He had been provided with new clothes, simple but well-made garments that emphasized his unusual coloring. In the grey winter light, he looked almost ethereal, like a figure from a dream or nightmare. "Miss Eleanor," he said, turning as she entered, "I wasn't expecting you." "I wanted to see how you were settling in," she replied, though they both knew this was a lie. She had come to take his measure one final time, to convince herself that what they were about to do was bearable. "The accommodations are very comfortable," Samuel said carefully, "much better than anything I've known before." Eleanor walked to the window and stood beside him, close enough to catch the scent of the soap he had been provided, lavender and rosemary, expensive and refined. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the garden below. "I've been thinking about my mother," he said finally. "She died when I was 12, but before that, she used to tell me stories about Africa, about the life her grandmother remembered before the ships came. She said that survival sometimes required becoming someone you never thought you could be." Eleanor felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. "Do you think she would understand what you're doing?" "I think she would understand that the alternative is worse," Samuel replied, "and I think she would want any children I father to have chances she could never give me." They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the house servants go about their duties in the garden below. Eleanor found herself studying Samuel's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw and the intelligence in his pale eyes. Tomorrow this man would become her lover, not by choice but by necessity. The thought filled her with a mixture of revulsion and something else she didn't want to name. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that I don't see you as property. Whatever happens between us, I want you to remember that." Samuel turned to look at her directly, and she saw something shift in his expression. "Thank you for saying that, Miss Eleanor. It means more than you might realize." That evening, Margaret called Eleanor to her private sitting room for what she termed final preparations. The conversation that followed was clinical and horrifying, as Margaret outlined expectations and procedures with the detachment of a livestock breeder discussing animal husbandry. "The goal is conception as quickly as possible," Margaret explained, consulting notes she had made in her precise handwriting. "Once pregnancy is confirmed, the arrangement with Samuel will be suspended until after the birth. If the child is male, we'll have achieved our primary objective. If female, we'll need to continue until we have at least one male heir." Eleanor listened with growing nausea as her mother detailed schedules, dietary recommendations, and even suggested positions that might increase the likelihood of conception. The reduction of human intimacy to mechanical function was almost unbearable. "What if I can't go through with it?" Eleanor asked when Margaret finished her recitation. "Then Catherine will take your place, and you'll live with the knowledge that your sister sacrificed herself because of your weakness," Margaret replied without hesitation. The next evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself was mocking the unnaturalness of what was about to occur. Eleanor dressed with unusual care, choosing a simple blue dress that could be easily removed. Her hands shook as she arranged her hair, and she had to stop twice to steady herself against her dressing table. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. I wanted to say—" "Don't," Eleanor said quickly. "Please don't say anything. I need to do this without thinking about what it means." Catherine nodded and withdrew, leaving Eleanor alone with her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed and brittle, aged beyond her 21 years by the weight of impossible choices. The walk to the East Wing felt endless, each step echoing in the quiet hallways like a funeral march. Eleanor passed portraits of her ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress with expressions of judgment or pity. Samuel's door was slightly ajar, lamplight spilling into the hallway. Eleanor paused outside, her hand raised to knock, paralyzed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. Inside, she could hear the soft sound of pages turning. Samuel was reading, perhaps trying to distract himself from the approaching encounter. She knocked softly, and the sound of pages stopped immediately. "Come in." Samuel's voice was steady, but she could hear the tension beneath it. Eleanor entered to find Samuel standing by the fireplace, where a small fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. He had been reading a volume of Shakespeare. Hamlet, she noticed, wondering if the choice was deliberate or ironic. "Miss Eleanor," he said, setting the book aside, "would you like some tea? I can ring for—" "No," Eleanor interrupted, then softened her tone. "No, thank you. I think we should just—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice what they both knew had to happen. Samuel nodded understanding and moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. "We don't have to rush," he said gently. "We can talk first if you'd like." Eleanor almost laughed at the absurdity of it, making conversation before committing what felt like mutual violation. But something in Samuel's manner, a kindness that transcended their circumstances, made her nod. They sat in the chairs by the fire, maintaining careful distance while trying to find words for the impossible situation. Samuel spoke about the books he had been reading, his voice calm and cultured, in a way that reminded Eleanor that intelligence and dignity weren't privileges reserved for the free. Eleanor found herself talking about her childhood, about the dreams she had harbored, before understanding that society would never allow her to pursue them. The conversation was surreal, two people discussing literature and lost hopes while preparing to engage in an act that would bind them together in the most intimate way possible. As the fire burned lower, the reality of their purpose became impossible to ignore. Samuel stood first, extending his hand to Eleanor with a gesture that was both invitation and question. "Are you certain?" he asked, his pale eyes searching her face. Eleanor took his hand, noting its warmth and strength. "I'm certain that we have no choice. Perhaps that's enough." What followed was neither the brutal violation Eleanor had feared, nor the romantic encounter her girlish dreams had once imagined. It was something else entirely, a careful, almost ceremonial joining of two people who understood that they were both victims of circumstances beyond their control. Samuel was gentle and patient, treating Eleanor's body with a respect that made her want to weep. There was no passion, but there was kindness, and in that moment kindness felt like a miracle. Afterward, they lay in the darkness without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor felt fundamentally changed, not just by the physical act, but by the recognition of Samuel's humanity in the most intimate possible way. He was not the faceless tool her mother had described, but a man with thoughts and feelings and dreams that had been crushed by a system that refused to acknowledge his worth. "I should go," Eleanor whispered finally. "Yes," Samuel agreed, but neither of them moved immediately. When Eleanor finally rose and dressed, Samuel remained in bed, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. At the door, she paused and looked back. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being kind." Samuel's smile was sad but genuine. "Thank you for seeing me as human." Eleanor returned to her room and sat by her window until dawn, watching the sun rise over the plantation that might now be saved. She felt hollow and strange, as if she had left part of herself in that room in the East Wing. But she also felt something else, a grim satisfaction that she had done what was necessary, that she had protected her family's legacy even at the cost of her own innocence. In the days that followed, the routine was established. Eleanor would visit Samuel 3 times a week, always in the evening, always with the same careful ritual of conversation, followed by mechanical intimacy. They spoke of books and philosophy, of the world beyond the plantation's borders, of dreams that neither would ever be able to pursue. Catherine's turn came 2 weeks later, and Eleanor watched her sister's transformation with a mixture of guilt and relief. Catherine emerged from her first encounter with Samuel pale and shaken, but also with a strange new dignity, as if she had passed some terrible test of adulthood. Mary continued to resist, but her resistance was weakening as the legal pressure mounted. Their uncles had filed formal papers claiming the plantation, and Margaret's lawyers warned that they had perhaps 2 weeks before the courts would rule in favor of the male relatives. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the outcome of this desperate gamble. Servants whispered in corners, sensing the tension without understanding its source. The normal rhythms of plantation life continued, but underneath lay a current of anticipation and dread. And in the East Wing, Samuel waited each evening for whichever daughter would come to him, treating each with the same careful kindness, while knowing that he was both savior and destroyer of the family he was meant to preserve. Spring arrived early at Hensley Manor, bringing with it a cruel mockery of renewal and hope. The dogwood trees bloomed in profusion around the house, their white petals drifting like snow across the manicured lawns, while inside, the family waited for news that would determine their fate. Eleanor had missed her monthly courses twice now, and the morning sickness that left her retching into her wash basin confirmed what they all suspected. Catherine, too, showed signs of pregnancy, though she was only a few weeks behind her sister. The plan was working with an efficiency that felt both miraculous and damning. Mary had finally capitulated after their uncle's lawyers served notice that the plantation would be seized within the week, unless the family could produce a male heir or legal guardian. Her first night with Samuel had been a disaster of tears and revulsion, but she had returned the next evening with grim determination, understanding finally that her sister's sacrifices would be meaningless without her participation. Margaret moved through the house like a general surveying a successful campaign, her satisfaction barely concealed beneath a veneer of maternal concern. She had commissioned new dresses for her daughters to accommodate their changing figures and had already begun planning the nursery that would house the future Hensley heirs. But success came with complications that Margaret had not fully anticipated. The most immediate was Dr. Harrison, the family physician, whose examination of Eleanor raised uncomfortable questions. "The timing is unusual, Doctor," Harrison said carefully as he packed his medical bag after confirming Eleanor's pregnancy. "Given that you've shown no interest in any of the local young men, I'm curious about the father's identity." Margaret, who had been present during the examination, maintained her composure with iron will. "Eleanor has been corresponding with a young man from Savannah. The relationship developed more quickly than we anticipated." Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And will this young man be coming forward to claim responsibility?" "The situation is complicated," Margaret replied smoothly. "Family obligations may prevent an immediate marriage, but arrangements are being made." The doctor nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "I trust you'll inform me when these arrangements are finalized. In the meantime, Eleanor should rest and avoid any strenuous activity." After Dr. Harrison left, Margaret found Eleanor in the morning room, staring out at the gardens where Samuel could be seen working among the flower beds. His reassignment to outdoor duties had been necessary to maintain the fiction that he was simply another field hand, but Eleanor found herself watching him with a mixture of longing and revulsion that disturbed her deeply. "You handled that well," Margaret said, settling into the chair beside her daughter. "Did I?" Eleanor's voice was flat, emotionless. "I felt like he could see right through our lies. Dr. Harrison has been with this family for 20 years. He's discreet and loyal. Even if he suspects something, he won't act on it." Eleanor turned to study her mother's face. "What happens when the baby is born? How do we explain a child that might not look entirely conventional?" Margaret had been dreading this question, though she had prepared for it. "Samuel's condition works in our favor. Any unusual coloring can be attributed to a recessive trait from your fictional father's family. And if the child shows other characteristics—" "You mean if the child looks obviously mixed?" "Then we'll deal with that situation when it arises," Margaret said firmly. "But Samuel was chosen specifically because his appearance minimizes that risk." Eleanor returned her gaze to the window, where Samuel was now pruning the rose bushes with careful precision. "I dream about him sometimes," she said quietly. Not romantic dreams, but I dream that he's free, that he's teaching children to read in some northern city where no one knows what he was." Margaret felt a chill of unease at her daughter's words. "Eleanor, you must not allow yourself to develop feelings for him. What happened between you was necessary, nothing more." "Was it?" Eleanor's voice carried a bitter edge. "Or have we simply found a more sophisticated way to perpetuate the same cruelties we've always practiced?" Before Margaret could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Mother, there's a problem. Mary is refusing to continue with the arrangement." Margaret rose swiftly, her jaw tightening with anger. "Where is she?" "In her room. She's been there since yesterday evening. She won't come out, won't eat, won't speak to anyone." Margaret found Mary barricaded in her bedroom, having pushed her dressing table against the door. Through the wooden barrier, she could hear her youngest daughter sobbing with the kind of raw anguish that spoke of complete emotional collapse. "Mary, open this door immediately," Margaret commanded. "I can't do it anymore." Mary's voice was muffled but audible. "I can't pretend that what we're doing is anything other than monstrous. What we're doing is surviving," Margaret replied sharply. "And you're being selfish and childish." "I'm being human!" Mary's voice rose to a near scream. "I'm refusing to participate in the systematic rape of a man who has no choice in the matter." The word hung in the air like a curse, naming the thing they had all been carefully avoiding. Margaret felt her carefully constructed justifications crumble slightly under the weight of her daughter's accusation. "Mary, you will open this door, and you will fulfill your obligations to this family." "No." Mary's voice was quieter now, but filled with steel. "I won't. And if you try to force me, I'll tell everyone what we've done. I'll destroy us all before I'll be party to this anymore." Margaret stood outside her daughter's door for a long moment, weighing her options. Mary's threat was not idle. The girl had always been too idealistic for her own good, and she was quite capable of destroying the family to preserve her conscience. That evening, Margaret called Eleanor and Catherine to her study for an emergency conference. Both daughters looked exhausted, worn down by months of stress and moral compromise. "Mary's refusal creates a significant problem," Margaret began without preamble. "If she's not participating in the arrangement, we can't be certain of producing enough heirs to secure our position." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Mother, perhaps we should consider that Mary might be right. What we've done, what we're doing, it's not sustainable." "What's not sustainable is allowing this family to be destroyed by moral squeamishness," Margaret snapped. "We've come too far to turn back now." Catherine, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "What if we told Samuel he could leave? What if we gave him his freedom and enough money to start a new life somewhere else?" Margaret stared at her daughter as if she had suggested burning down the house. "Absolutely not. Samuel knows too much about our arrangement. If he were to talk—" "He wouldn't," Eleanor said quietly. "He's not vindictive, and he understands the consequences as well as we do." "You're both being naive," Margaret replied coldly. "Samuel is property, and property doesn't get to choose its own fate. Besides, we may need him again if either of you bears daughters." The callousness of the statement hit both daughters like a physical blow. Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat as she realized that her mother saw Samuel not as a human being who had helped save their family, but as a resource to be used and discarded at will. "I won't do it again," Eleanor said firmly. "Whatever happens with this pregnancy, I won't subject myself or Samuel to that arrangement again." "Nor will I," Catherine added, her voice shaking but determined. Margaret looked between her daughters and saw something that chilled her, a unity of purpose that excluded her entirely. They had been changed by their experiences with Samuel, had developed a perspective that threatened everything she had worked to achieve. "Then you're both fools," Margaret said finally, "and you'll regret this sentimentality when you're living in poverty." But even as she spoke, Margaret knew that something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamic. Her daughters were no longer the malleable tools she had counted on, and Samuel had become something more dangerous than a simple slave. He had become a catalyst for moral awakening that threatened to undermine everything. The crisis came to a head 3 days later when Dr. Harrison returned for a follow-up examination of Eleanor. This time he brought with him a colleague from Atlanta, Dr. Pemberton, who specialized in difficult pregnancies. The examination proceeded normally until Dr. Pemberton made an observation that sent ice through Margaret's veins. "Interesting," the specialist murmured, studying Eleanor's abdomen. "The positioning and development suggest conception occurred earlier than you indicated. I'd estimate this pregnancy at nearly 4 months, not the 2 months you mentioned." Margaret's mind raced, calculating dates and trying to construct a plausible explanation. Eleanor may have been mistaken about the timing of her last courses, the stress of her father's death. Dr. Pemberton nodded thoughtfully, but his next words destroyed any hope of maintaining the deception. "Of course, though I must say, some of the physical characteristics I'm observing are quite unusual. The skin tone, the hair texture. Has there been any history of mixed ancestry in the father's family?" The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor went white as parchment, while Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Dr. Harrison looked between them with growing understanding and horror. "I think," Dr. Harrison said carefully, "that we need to have a private conversation, Margaret." After the doctors left, promising to return the following day for further consultation, Margaret found herself alone in her study with the wreckage of her carefully laid plans. The secret was out, or would be soon, and with it would come social destruction more complete than anything her brothers-in-law could have achieved. She was still sitting there when Samuel appeared in the doorway, having been summoned by one of the house servants. He looked older somehow, worn down by months of impossible circumstances. "You wanted to see me, Ma'am." Margaret studied his pale features, seeing for the first time not a tool or a solution, but a human being whose life she had irrevocably altered. "The doctors suspect something. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Samuel nodded slowly. "What do you want me to do?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities. Margaret could have him killed, could claim he had attacked her daughters and deserved execution. She could sell him to traders heading for the Deep South, where he would disappear into the cotton fields and never be seen again. Instead, she found herself asking, "What do you want to do?" Samuel's pale eyes widened slightly at the unexpected question. "I want to see my children born safely. I want to know that they'll have better lives than I've had. And then I want to disappear before I cause any more damage to your family." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart, which she had thought thoroughly hardened, but something deeper and more fundamental. "You could run tonight. I could give you money, papers, a horse. You could be in the next state before anyone knew you were gone. And leave Miss Eleanor and Miss Catherine to face the consequences alone?" Samuel shook his head. "No, ma'am, I won't abandon them now." That night, Margaret sat in her late husband's chair and wrote 3 letters. The first was to her lawyer, instructing him to prepare manumission papers for Samuel. The second was to a contact in Philadelphia, a Quaker woman who helped escaped slaves establish new lives in the North. The third letter was the hardest to write. It was addressed to her daughters, explaining her decision and asking for their forgiveness for the choices she had made in desperation and fear. When morning came, Margaret Hensley was found in her study, the letters arranged neatly on her desk beside an empty bottle of laudanum. Her final act had been to free Samuel legally, ensuring that whatever happened next, he would not face execution as a runaway slave. Eleanor found the letters when she came to inform her mother that Dr. Harrison had returned with the sheriff. She read them through tears, understanding finally the full weight of the burden her mother had carried and the price she had paid for her family's survival. Samuel left that same day, carrying papers that declared him a free man and enough money to start a new life far from Georgia. He said goodbye to Eleanor and Catherine privately, promising to write when he could, to let them know how their children's father fared in freedom. Eleanor gave birth to a son 3 months later, a beautiful child with pale skin and silver hair who was accepted without question as the legitimate Hensley heir. Catherine's daughter followed 2 months after that, a girl whose unusual coloring was attributed to her grandfather's foreign ancestry. Mary never married, dedicating her life instead to teaching freed slaves to read and write. She never spoke of the arrangement that had saved her family, but she never forgot the lesson it had taught her about the price of survival in a world built on the subjugation of others. The plantation remained in Hensley hands, passed down through Eleanor's son and his descendants. But the family was forever changed by the choices made in that desperate spring of 1849, when a widow's determination to preserve her legacy had led to consequences none of them could have foreseen. In the end, they had all paid a price for survival, Margaret with her life, Samuel with his freedom and his children, and the daughters with their innocence and their understanding of the world's fundamental cruelties. The legacy they preserved was built on foundations of moral compromise that would echo through generations, a reminder that sometimes the cost of winning is higher than anyone can afford to pay. 20 years later, Eleanor Hensley stood on the veranda of the manor house, watching her son Charles play in the gardens with his younger cousins. At 20, he had grown into a handsome young man with his father's unusual coloring and his mother's sharp intelligence. He was preparing to attend university in the fall, carrying with him the weight of a legacy he would never fully understand. The plantation had prospered under Eleanor's management, aided by the social changes that followed the war. The enslaved people had been freed, though many remained as paid workers, and the family had adapted to the new economic realities with the same pragmatic determination that had always defined the Hensleys. Catherine had married a kind man from Charleston who asked no uncomfortable questions about her daughter's parentage. She lived quietly now, finding peace in her garden and her charitable work with the local church. The shadows in her eyes had never fully disappeared, but she had learned to carry them with grace. Mary had never left the plantation, transforming the old slave quarters into a school for freed children. She taught reading and writing, with a passion that bordered on obsession, as if she could somehow atone for the family's past through education and kindness. She never married, never bore children of her own, but she mothered dozens of students who called her Miss Mary with genuine affection. The letters from Samuel had stopped coming 5 years ago. The last one had been postmarked from Chicago, where he had established a small business and married a woman who knew nothing of his past. He had written that he was happy, that he thought of his children often, and that he hoped they would grow up to be better people than the world that had created them. Eleanor kept those letters in a locked drawer in her mother's old desk, along with the manumission papers and Margaret's final confession. They were documents of a time that seemed both distant and immediate, a reminder of choices made in desperation that had shaped everything that followed. As she watched Charles laugh with his cousins, Eleanor wondered what he would think if he knew the truth of his conception. Would he understand the impossible circumstances that had brought him into being? Would he forgive the moral compromises that had secured his inheritance? The sound of footsteps on the veranda drew her from her thoughts. Dr. Harrison approached, older now and moving more slowly, but still the family's trusted physician and keeper of secrets. "Eleanor," he said with a gentle smile, "how are you feeling today?" "Reflective," she replied honestly. "Charles leaves for university next month. It's hard to believe how quickly time has passed." Dr. Harrison joined her at the railing, his gaze following hers to where the young man played in the garden. "He's a fine boy. You should be proud." "I am," Eleanor said quietly, "but I also wonder sometimes what price he'll pay for the choices we made to ensure his existence." "Every generation pays for the choices of those who came before," Dr. Harrison replied. "The question is whether they learn from those choices or repeat them." Eleanor nodded, thinking of the school Mary had built, of Catherine's quiet acts of charity, of her own efforts to treat their workers with dignity and fairness. Perhaps redemption was possible, not through forgetting the past, but through ensuring that its lessons shaped a better future. As the sun set over the plantation that had been saved through such terrible means, Eleanor made a silent promise to her son and to the father he would never know. She would tell him the truth when he was old enough to understand it, would ensure that he knew the full cost of his inheritance and the responsibility that came with it. The Hensley legacy would continue, but it would be tempered by knowledge and shaped by conscience. The sins of the past could not be undone, but they could be acknowledged, and perhaps in time they could be forgiven. In the distance, the church bells of the small town began to toll the evening hour, their bronze voices carrying across the fields where cotton still grew and where the ghosts of old choices still walked among the living. The manor house stood as it always had, solid and enduring, but the family within had been forever changed by the recognition that survival sometimes came at a price too high to calculate. Eleanor remained on the veranda long after the others had gone inside, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky and thinking about the man who had given her son life at the cost of his own freedom. Somewhere in the north, Samuel might be looking at the same stars, wondering about the children he had fathered and the family he had helped to save. The weight of that sacrifice would never leave her, but neither would the determination to ensure that it had not been in vain. The Hensley name would endure, but it would carry with it the memory of all those who had paid for its preservation and the promise that future generations would build something better from the ashes of the past. This story reminds us that the choices we make in desperate times echo through generations, shaping not just our own lives, but the lives of those who come after us. History is built on such moments of moral complexity, where survival and conscience collide in ways that forever change the course of human lives. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful historical stories that explore the hidden truths of our past. Share this story if it moved you, and let us know in the comments what you think about the impossible choices faced by the Hensley family. What would you have done in their situation? Sometimes there are no easy answers, only the weight of consequences we must learn to carry.